When a son finally sees the truth about his narcissistic parent, there is a moment in some people's lives that doesn't feel like discovering something new. It feels like remembering something they always knew but were never allowed to believe. For a son raised by a narcissistic parent, that moment rarely arrives during childhood. In fact, childhood is often the period when seeing the truth is almost impossible. A child depends on a parent not only for food, shelter, and protection, but also for understanding reality itself. When the person teaching you what love is also controls how you interpret your own experiences, confusion becomes normal. The child doesn't think, "Something is wrong with my parent." Instead, he quietly wonders, "What is wrong with me?" Today, we're going to explore one of the most profound psychological awakenings a son can experience, the moment he finally sees his narcissistic parent clearly. Not with anger alone, not with revenge in mind, but with enough emotional distance to recognize patterns that had shaped his entire identity for years. Let's begin with an important psychological principle. Children naturally assume their parents are right. This isn't because parents are always right. It's because believing your caregiver is safe is essential for survival. A young child cannot emotionally afford to conclude that the person responsible for their world is unpredictable or emotionally unsafe. The cost of that realization is simply too high. Instead, the child's mind makes a different calculation. If my parent is hurting me, there must be a reason. If they're disappointed in me, I must deserve it. If they never seem proud of me, I simply need to try harder. These beliefs are not signs of weakness. They are survival strategies. They allow a child to preserve hope by placing responsibility on himself rather than questioning the person he depends on most. Over time, this survival strategy becomes part of his personality. He learns to monitor every expression on his parent's face. He notices changes in tone before anyone else does. He becomes unusually sensitive to criticism. He celebrates achievements briefly before immediately asking what still isn't good enough. From the outside, people often describe him as responsible, mature, hardworking, or exceptionally considerate. Very few recognize that these qualities may have developed from chronic emotional adaptation rather than genuine freedom. Another pattern slowly develops. Love becomes associated with performance. The son begins believing affection must be earned rather than freely given. Good grades earn approval. Success earns temporary warmth. Obedience avoids conflict. Achievement creates brief moments of peace. Without realizing it, he starts measuring his value by his usefulness. This belief rarely remains inside the family. It follows him into adulthood. He becomes the employee who cannot stop proving himself, the friend who never asks for help, the partner who constantly fears disappointing someone, the man who apologizes even when he has done nothing wrong, not because these behaviors reflect who he truly is, because they once helped him survive. One of the most confusing aspects of growing up with a narcissistic parent is inconsistency. Some days the parent appears loving, supportive, even generous. Other days the same parent becomes cold, critical, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable. This unpredictability creates a powerful psychological effect. The child never knows which version of the parent will appear. As a result, he begins focusing less on his own emotions and more on managing theirs. His attention gradually shifts away from asking, "How do I feel?" toward asking, "What mood are they in today?" That single shift changes the course of emotional development. Instead of learning emotional security, he learns emotional vigilance. Instead of trusting his own experience, he learns to anticipate someone else's reactions. Years later, this pattern often continues automatically. He enters relationships where he feels responsible for maintaining another person's emotional stability. He mistakes anxiety for love. He mistakes walking on eggshells for commitment. He mistakes emotional exhaustion for loyalty. Then something unexpected happens. Sometimes it is a conversation with someone outside the family. Sometimes it is becoming a parent himself. Sometimes it is therapy. Sometimes it is reading about family dynamics and recognizing his own childhood in words written by a complete stranger. Whatever the catalyst, a single thought quietly appears. This wasn't normal. At first, that thought feels almost disloyal. Questioning a parent can produce enormous guilt, especially when that parent repeatedly reminded him of everything they sacrificed, everything they provided, everything they supposedly did for his own good. The son may immediately dismiss the realization. Perhaps he is exaggerating. Perhaps he is ungrateful. Perhaps everyone experiences childhood this way. These doubts are understandable. When one version of reality has been repeated for decades, questioning it feels almost like betraying your own history. Yet the evidence keeps accumulating. He notices that healthy families can disagree without humiliation. He notices parents apologizing to their children. He notices affection that doesn't depend on achievement. He notices respect flowing in both directions instead of only one. Slowly, the pieces begin fitting together. Events that once seemed unrelated suddenly form a pattern. The criticism, the comparison with siblings, the emotional manipulation, the constant need for approval, the guilt, the unpredictable affection. None of these moments existed in isolation. They formed a system that shaped not only how he viewed his parent, but how he viewed himself. And perhaps the hardest realization of all begins to emerge. The voice that has criticized him for years. The voice telling him he is never enough. The voice insisting perfection is the only path to acceptance. Was never truly his own. It was borrowed, learned, repeated so many times that it eventually sounded like his own thoughts. Recognizing this is painful, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Because once a son realizes that the harshest voice inside his mind did not begin with him, he gains something he never truly had before, the possibility of choosing a different one. Once a son begins recognizing the patterns of a narcissistic parent, many people assume the hardest part is over. In reality, it is often just beginning. Because seeing the truth and accepting the truth are two very different psychological processes. Recognition happens in moments. Acceptance often takes years. At first, the realization doesn't usually bring relief. It brings conflict. Part of him feels validated. Finally, experiences that never made sense begin fitting together. Memories that once seemed isolated suddenly reveal a pattern. But another part of him immediately resists that conclusion. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe they were just under stress. Maybe they loved me the best way they knew how. These thoughts are not signs that he is mistaken. They are signs that two realities are colliding. One reality is the story he was taught growing up. The other is the story his lived experience has been trying to tell him all along. Reconciling those two versions of reality is emotionally exhausting. Many sons spend months or even years moving back and forth between clarity and doubt. This internal conflict is often intensified by guilt. Family culture may have taught him that questioning a parent is disrespectful, that loyalty means silence, that gratitude requires overlooking repeated emotional harm. As an adult, those beliefs can become invisible rules governing every decision. He may feel guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for saying no, guilty for limiting contact, guilty for prioritizing his own mental health. The guilt feels real. But guilt is not always evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is evidence that you are doing something different. There is another emotional hurdle that many sons encounter: grief. Not only grief for the relationship they had, but grief for the relationship they hoped to have. They mourn birthdays that never felt emotionally safe, conversations that never happened, words of encouragement they waited years to hear, simple affection that always seemed conditional. This grief is unique because it is directed towards something that never fully existed. He is grieving the parent he needed rather than the parent he actually had. That distinction matters because healing often begins when he stops waiting for the past to become different. Another important shift occurs when he notices how childhood patterns continue influencing adult relationships. He may realize that he apologizes excessively, that criticism feels catastrophic, that praise makes him uncomfortable, that he instinctively avoids conflict even when something deeply matters to him. These habits did not appear by accident. They developed in an environment where emotional safety depended upon adaptation. As a child, those adaptations helped him survive. As an adult, they may quietly limit his ability to build healthy relationships. Recognizing this is not about blaming parents for every difficulty. It is about understanding how early environments shape later expectations. Once those expectations become visible, they can begin changing. This process also changes the way he defines strength. Earlier, strength meant enduring, staying silent, absorbing criticism, never expressing emotional pain, never disappointing anyone. As healing progresses, strength begins looking very different. Strength becomes honesty, the courage to say, "That hurt," the willingness to admit, "I deserved better," the ability to recognize that protecting his own well-being is not selfish, it is necessary. There is another realization that often surprises him. He cannot heal by convincing his parent to finally understand. Many sons spend years searching for the perfect conversation, the perfect explanation, the perfect words that will finally make their parent recognize the impact of years of emotional control, criticism, or manipulation. Sometimes meaningful conversations are possible. Often they are not. Healing cannot depend entirely upon another person's willingness to acknowledge reality. If it does, peace remains permanently outside his control. This is why many therapists encourage focusing less on changing the parent and more on changing the son's relationship to the past. The memories remain, the history remains, but the meaning attached to those experiences can evolve. He no longer sees himself through the parent's critical lens. He begins seeing himself through his own. Perhaps that is the most important transformation taking place. He slowly separates his identity from the role he played within the family. He realizes he was never born to spend his entire life earning approval that was always conditional. He was never meant to carry responsibility for another adult's emotional stability, and he was never required to sacrifice his own mental health simply to preserve the appearance of family harmony. That realization is both painful and freeing, because it marks the point where survival gradually gives way to genuine emotional growth. There comes a point in healing that many sons never expect. It is not the day they finally understand their parent. It is the day they stop needing to. For years, they searched for an explanation that would make everything fit together. They replayed conversations, remembered childhood moments from different angles, wondered whether they had misunderstood what happened. They hoped that if they could just discover the missing piece, the pain would finally disappear. But healing gradually teaches something different. Not every question receives a satisfying answer. Not every parent develops the insight necessary to recognize the emotional impact of their behavior. Waiting for that moment can quietly keep a son emotionally tied to the very relationship he is trying to recover from. One of the greatest acts of emotional maturity is accepting that clarity does not always require agreement. He can know what happened, even if his parent never admits it. He can remember his experiences without needing someone else to validate every detail. That confidence does not come from anger. It comes from rebuilding trust in his own perception. For many years, he may have questioned his instincts. If something felt unfair, he wondered whether he was simply too sensitive. If criticism felt excessive, he assumed he had failed. If affection disappeared after he expressed disagreement, he blamed himself for causing conflict. These patterns slowly trained him to distrust his own emotional experience. Recovery reverses that process. Instead of immediately dismissing his feelings, he begins exploring them. Instead of asking, "Am I wrong for feeling this?" he begins asking, "What is this feeling trying to teach me?" That small change creates enormous psychological freedom. Another important transformation involves forgiveness. Few subjects create more confusion than forgiveness after growing up with a narcissistic parent. Some people believe forgiveness means pretending nothing happened. Others believe it requires rebuilding the relationship exactly as it was before. Neither definition is psychologically necessary. Forgiveness for many people simply means refusing to let resentment control the direction of their future. It does not erase accountability. It does not remove consequences. It does not require unlimited access to your life. A son may choose compassion while still maintaining healthy distance. He may wish his parent well while recognizing that frequent contact consistently harms his emotional well-being. These choices are not contradictory. They are examples of boundaries shaped by experience rather than guilt. Another lesson emerges through adulthood. He begins recognizing that the patterns learned in childhood do not have to continue into the next generation. If he becomes a father himself, this realization often carries enormous emotional weight. He notices moments when his own child makes a mistake. The old voice inside him whispers criticism, perfection, control, shame. But another voice has begun growing stronger. The voice developed through reflection, healing, and conscious choice. Instead of repeating the pattern, he pauses, he listens, he corrects without humiliating, he teaches without withdrawing love, he apologizes when he gets something wrong. These moments may appear small. In reality, they represent the breaking of a family cycle that may have existed for decades. Healing is often less dramatic than people imagine. It is built through ordinary decisions repeated consistently, choosing calm instead of control, curiosity instead of criticism, respect instead of intimidation. Those choices reshape families over time. There is another unexpected change. Earlier in life, approval may have felt like the most valuable thing in the world. Every achievement was measured against one question: will they finally be proud of me? Many sons spend years chasing that moment. Some achieve extraordinary success, successful careers, financial stability, professional recognition, yet the approval they hoped for either never arrives or lasts only briefly before expectations move again. Eventually, a different realization appears. The approval he truly needed was never external. It was his own. Learning to respect himself independently of parental validation becomes one of the greatest milestones in recovery. It changes how he approaches work, friendships, marriage, parenthood. Every area of life becomes less driven by proving and more guided by purpose. Perhaps the most beautiful transformation happens quietly. One day he notices that his decisions are no longer reactions to childhood. He chooses relationships because they are healthy, not because they feel familiar. He speaks honestly without overwhelming fear of rejection. He allows himself to rest without believing his worth depends on constant productivity. He celebrates success without immediately searching for the next impossible standard. These changes may seem ordinary. For someone raised in chronic emotional criticism, they are extraordinary. Finally, he comes to understand something that once felt impossible. Seeing the truth about his parent does not require abandoning compassion. It simply requires placing compassion beside reality instead of using it to replace reality. He can acknowledge that his parent may have carried their own wounds. He can also acknowledge that those wounds affected him deeply. Both statements can be true. Understanding someone's pain does not erase the impact of their behavior. Holding both truths at the same time is a sign of emotional maturity. It allows him to move beyond simple blame toward genuine wisdom. And perhaps that is the greatest gift hidden within this difficult journey. Not that he discovers a perfect explanation for everything that happened, but that he discovers himself apart from it. He realizes that his identity is not limited to the role he played in his family. He is not simply the child who tried to earn love. He is not simply the son who carried impossible expectations. He is not simply the person who survived a difficult upbringing. He is someone capable of creating relationships built on honesty instead of fear, respect instead of control, consistency instead of unpredictability, and unconditional care instead of conditional approval. The truth about his parent may explain his past, but it does not have to determine his future, because the greatest victory is not proving that someone else was wrong. It is building a life where their patterns no longer decide who you become. One of the most unexpected parts of this journey is that healing rarely happens in a straight line. Many sons believe that once they finally see the truth about a narcissistic parent, everything will suddenly become clear, and the emotional burden they've carried for years will simply disappear. But psychology tells a different story. Awareness is only the beginning. Acceptance takes much longer. There will be days when everything makes perfect sense, followed by days when old doubts quietly return. A simple phone call, a holiday gathering, or even hearing a familiar phrase can awaken emotions you believed you had already left behind. This isn't failure. It's how the brain reorganizes years of conditioning into a healthier understanding of reality. One of the reasons this process feels so challenging is because the son wasn't only shaped by the parent's behavior, he was shaped by the meaning he attached to it. Throughout childhood, he learned to measure himself through someone else's approval. Instead of asking, "What kind of person do I want to become?" he learned to ask, "What do I need to do to finally be enough?" Those two questions lead to completely different lives. Without realizing it, he may spend years chasing achievements that were never truly his own. Success becomes less about personal fulfillment and more about proving his worth. Every promotion, every accomplishment, every goal carries the silent hope that maybe this time he'll finally receive the validation he's been searching for since childhood. But something remarkable happens during healing. He begins noticing that every time he reaches one goal, another immediately replaces it. The satisfaction never lasts. The feeling of finally being enough always seems just out of reach. Then a different realization begins to emerge. The problem was never that he hadn't accomplished enough. The problem was that he had been asking achievement to solve an emotional wound that achievement was never designed to heal. This changes everything. Instead of building a life around proving himself, he slowly begins building a life around knowing himself. That distinction creates enormous freedom. Another transformation appears in the way he experiences criticism. Growing up with a narcissistic parent often means criticism wasn't simply feedback. It became a measure of identity. A small mistake felt like complete failure. A disagreement felt like rejection. An imperfect decision felt like evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with him. These reactions don't disappear overnight. Even as an adult, constructive feedback may trigger emotions that seem much larger than the situation itself. His logical mind understands that someone is simply offering advice. His nervous system reacts as though love itself is being threatened. Understanding this difference is incredibly important. Healing isn't just changing thoughts. It's allowing the body to learn that the present is different from the past. Slowly, he discovers that making mistakes no longer has to mean losing connection. Healthy people can disagree without humiliation. Healthy relationships survive honest conversations. Healthy love doesn't disappear because someone isn't perfect. This realization begins rebuilding something he never fully developed in childhood: emotional safety. Another quiet change happens in the relationships he chooses. Earlier in life, unpredictability often felt strangely familiar. Emotionally unavailable people felt exciting. Inconsistent affection felt normal. He unconsciously gravitated toward dynamics that resembled what he experienced growing up, not because they were healthy, but because they were familiar. Psychologists sometimes describe this as repeating emotional patterns until they're consciously understood. Healing interrupts this cycle. For the first time, he notices the difference between excitement and security. Someone who communicates consistently no longer feels boring. Someone who respects boundaries no longer feels distant. Someone who apologizes sincerely no longer seems unusual. These qualities begin replacing emotional intensity as the foundation of attraction. That shift changes every future relationship. There is another lesson that quietly transforms his life. He realizes he is not responsible for fixing people who refuse to acknowledge their own behavior. This can be one of the hardest truths for sons of narcissistic parents to accept. As children, they often became emotional caretakers. They learned to anticipate moods, prevent conflict, absorb blame, maintain peace. Those habits were survival strategies. As adults, they often become invisible responsibilities carried into every relationship. Healing asks him to put those responsibilities down, not because he has stopped caring, because he finally understands the difference between compassion and responsibility. He can care about someone without carrying their emotional life on his shoulders. He can understand someone's past without sacrificing his own future. He can wish someone healing without making their healing his personal mission. That realization removes an enormous emotional weight. Perhaps the greatest transformation happens so gradually that he barely notices it. One day he wakes up and realizes he no longer spends hours replaying old conversations. He no longer imagines different endings. He no longer wonders what he could have said differently. His mind has stopped trying to solve a problem that was never his to solve. Instead, his attention begins moving toward his own life, his friendships, his family, his goals, his peace, his future. The parent who once occupied so much emotional space slowly occupies less and less, not because the past disappeared, but because his own life has finally become larger than it. And perhaps that is the greatest sign of healing, not forgetting what happened, not pretending it didn't matter, but reaching a place where the past explains you without controlling you, where childhood shaped you without defining you, where the truth about your parent becomes only one chapter of your story, not the title of your life. That is where genuine freedom begins, not when your parent finally changes, not when they finally apologize, not when they suddenly become the person you always hoped they could be. Real freedom begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else's transformation to give you permission to begin your own. Because from that moment forward, your future is no longer built around surviving your past. It is built around creating a life that your younger self never believed was possible, a life defined by peace instead of fear, confidence instead of constant self-doubt, and relationships built on mutual respect instead of conditional love.